Hello and welcome, Adam's children, both faithful and non-believers, to this week's short sermon where we explore what a Fallout game set in the Windy City itself would be like. With how prominent Chicago is in the story of America, the location would be interesting all in and of itself. However, a game set here would accomplish a lot more than just that. The outskirts of Chicago is where the awkward middle child of the Fallout series, Fallout Tactics, comes into play. While the game itself is a bit controversial amongst the fanbase, Todd Howard, in an interview around Fallout 3's launch when he was asked about what parts of the previous games would be in Fallout 3, said, "For our purposes, neither Fallout Tactics nor Fallout Brotherhood of Steel happened." Well, that seems pretty open and shut then. Fallout Tactics and the events that unfold are not canon. Except that isn't the whole story. Parts of Tactics have been referenced in Bethesda's Fallout games. So what's the deal? Is it canon or semi-canon? And if so, what parts are actually canon? Well, a Fallout Chicago could settle much of this. You could say that a Fallout Chicago would be Fallout Tactics Reckoning, a game that would force Bethesda to show us what is really going on. Let's get to it. And to be clear, this is not fan fiction. This is a compilation of lore, real-world history, and facts that could, would, and should affect the setting, factions, and world details of a game set in Chicago. So the first important thing, whenever we consider a place as a future Fallout location, is to know what lore previous games have established. This helps shape the ideas and the kinds of things that we can expect, and of course, respecting the previously established lore keeps things cohesive. The most important points of lore that will shape what a game centered in Chicago would be like is the confirmed presence of two of Fallout's favorite groups, the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave. While I myself suffer from Brotherhood fatigue and, to a lesser extent, Enclave fatigue, since they seem to be constantly playing huge roles in every single Fallout game, lore is lore. Fallout 3 confirms a Brotherhood of Steel presence in Chicago in two different pieces of dialogue. Elizabeth Jameson, the Brotherhood Proctor of the Order of the Quill, who is in charge of the proper preservation of historical records, and other related information for the Brotherhood, will tell the Lone Wanderer this when asked about the supermutants.
The Brotherhood has been battling supermutants for decades. First out west, then in Chicago, now here.
Similarly, Scribe Rothschild, when asked about where the rest of the Brotherhood is, will state,
"There's also a small detachment in Chicago, but they're off the radar. Gone rogue. Long story."
The Fallout 3 official game guide also states that some supermutants fled east after the destruction of the Master, and that some of these supermutants made it as far as Chicago, where some had assimilated with the Brotherhood of Steel located there. Fallout 4 has a much less specific reference where two Brotherhood soldiers are overheard speaking, with one talking about other previous airships that the Brotherhood had that were destroyed in an attempt to fight supermutants, with one crashing in the Midwest, which is a reference to Fallout Tactics, where one of the large airships crashed just outside of Chicago. Those are the details that we get about the Brotherhood of Steel in Chicago, that they are fighting supermutants there, and that this small detachment has broken off to do their own thing. Fallout 4 seems to imply that this detachment got there via a crashed airship too. They also seem to break some common Brotherhood practices by allowing some supermutants into their ranks, and maybe one of the reasons that Rothschild describes them as having gone rogue. It is interesting that three of these sources also reference supermutants when speaking of the Brotherhood, so it seems they are a rather big problem for the Brotherhood in Chicago. But the situation is more complicated than that, because they apparently let some supermutants join their ranks. We get one reference to the Enclave being present in Chicago, and this is from Fallout New Vegas. Eddie has preserved a recording of one of his original creators, Dr. Whitley, who was stationed at Adams Air Force Base in Fallout 3, sent Eddie on a journey to the Navarro outpost, and along the way, Eddie was supposed to go to Chicago and get any needed repairs from the Enclave before continuing. Eddie also picked up an Illinois license plate specifically mentioning having gotten it in Chicago. There are other references to Chicago that don't have much impact, like some characters in Fallout 76 considering traveling to Chicago, or the real detective Nick Valentine, whose personality was uploaded into the synth of the same name in Fallout 4, who was from Chicago. These might be fun callbacks, but overall wouldn't have much bearing on the story or setting. So to summarize what other games have confirmed, a Brotherhood detachment is in Chicago, most likely the result of a crashed airship. This detachment is fighting super mutants in this area and also letting some into their ranks. They are also acting independently of the main organization. The Enclave has an outpost in Chicago. However, we don't know how many there are, nor do we really know what they are up to. So the word from Todd himself is that Tactics is not considered canon, but there are obviously details of Tactics that the previous games seem to confirm. In Tactics, many super mutants fled east after the destruction of the Master and can be found in locations such as St. Louis, well south of Chicago, Jefferson City, which is farther west, Kansas City, which is even farther west, and Osceola, which is south of Kansas City. In Tactics, the super mutants are not actually in the Chicago area, but the statements in Fallout 3 seem to imply that the fighting is happening in Chicago, so that would be one departure from the details of Tactics, although really it's not that huge. The airship part also seems to be true based on Fallout 4, but since details are scant, we can't say with confidence how true the Fallout Tactics story of the airships being downed due to a storm really is. The detail about the Brotherhood allowing super mutants to join their ranks is also a detail from Tactics that is true, although this happens a little later in the quest when you actually confront the super mutants and defeat their leader. Tactics also seems to show a futuristic architectural style for Chicago, as well as an extremely destructive scene where the entire sky is ablaze and consuming the city, or blowing buildings apart. And then we get a chance to see the post-war skyline in the intro, where it seems like everything has seen at least some destruction. Some buildings have lost their tops, many have lost walls or windows, and almost all of them seem to be leaning. And this seems to imply that the city may be uninhabitable, which is also hinted at by the fact that in Fallout Tactics, there are no locations within the city proper that can be visited. There are lots of other factions, locations, and events that happen in Fallout Tactics, but they all take place far enough away that I don't think any of it would significantly impact the city of Chicago, which is what is taking front and center here. However, we would probably get a chance to see how far Bethesda was willing to confirm details of Tactics by hearing in-game rumors and events that would reference groups like the Beast Lords, the Calculator, or Gamoran's army. The next order of business is to determine a reasonable map area for the game, and I think this would actually be fairly straightforward. Much like how other city-centered games show the bulk of or the entirety of downtown and outer city areas, Chicago would not really be any different. The Chicago downtown and lakeshore area is very interesting, with many unique locations, and would make for great locations to explore. So I think it makes sense for the lakeshore to be the easternmost border, with the downtown area being centered on the eastern border. I chose the northeast border to include Wrigley Field and Uptown on the east side, and I chose to have the O'Hare International Airport in the northwest corner. Looking south, the southeast border is kind of arbitrary, but I put it here to help make a square shape, with the southwest corner being on the edge of Red Gate Woods. And if you don't know why I chose to include this area, we'll get to it. This makes an area of 403 square miles, which is more than the area of Washington, D.C. that Fallout 3 covers, which is around 41 square miles, but less than Boston, which covers an area around 570 miles. Now, these numbers are unimportant. All that matters is that the map area is large enough and interesting enough for hours and hours of entertainment, and all the game maps, even the relatively tiny Fallout 3 map, have to shrink down the actual geography because it's just not feasible to scale the game to real life. This is also assuming that Lake Michigan is mostly the same and not iced over or partially or wholly drained or something wild like that. The map really is subjective, but I do think having the lake shore as the eastern border and centering on downtown is the best way to start. And then how far north, south, or west you go is up for debate. We know the where, but how about the when? Again, this is subjective, but when it takes place will have an effect on who we could see in the game. Since Bethesda seems to be keeping some of the details of Fallout Tactics in the absence of any other information, we can assume that the dates given in Tactics may be approximately correct. We know the game takes place in 2197, so if this hypothetical Fallout Chicago were to take place well before 2197, then there would most likely not be any Brotherhood, and events would be happening around the same time as the first Fallout or earlier. That could also mean no super mutants, since they haven't fled the destruction of the Master or haven't had enough time to migrate from the West Coast. There's no reason to believe, though, that the Enclave outpost spoken of wouldn't exist, since it's likely the Enclave have existed in such a prominent city since before the Great War. If the game were to take place around 2197, then it's likely the Brotherhood would have prominence in the game, as well as super mutants, since they're apparently fighting them, and the Enclave would be a big question mark. Maybe they're there but waiting, or maybe they pull a full Fallout 3 and charge into the Brotherhood super mutant fray. If the game were to take place after the events of Fallout 3 in 2277, then maybe there could be some interaction between the Midwest Brotherhood in Chicago and the East Coast Brotherhood. A quick history of Chicago is important to consider because it informs what kinds of people, events, and other things that could have an influence on the game. This will not be exhaustive, but it will highlight events that could influence the setting. Chicago came to prominence as a result of being a major transport hub as early as the late 1800s. With dozens of rail lines and a canal project that connected Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River, if you wanted to ship products across the country, it most likely went through Chicago. Chicago expanded rapidly and attracted many immigrants, amassing a sizable Irish Catholic population. Since Chicago was such an important transportation hub and to this day has a tremendous amount of shipping traffic, this could be reflected in-game. There are several very large rail yards that would be in the map area. The Corwith, the BNSF Cicero, and BNSF Metra intermodal rail yards are only 3 examples of these massive yards. They could make interesting settlements where dwellings are built out of rail cars and containers, or the game could make controlling these rail yards more strategic. Maybe some of these lines could still function to some degree, and the ability to transport supplies, trade goods, or move people over great distances is desirable enough that they are actively being fought over. The canal project that connects to the Mississippi, if it still does in Fallout, could also be important, or a way for a faraway foreign faction to come to Chicago by going up the Mississippi and canal. To the point of the huge influence Catholicism has had on Chicago, maybe it would be an opportunity to see how the faith has dealt with or changed due to the Great War, and the high number of beautiful Catholic churches would definitely need to be found when exploring the Chicago wastes. In 1871, one of the most well-known events occurred, the infamous Great Chicago Fire that destroyed a large portion of the city, leaving around 100,000 people homeless, and would go on to shape the city for decades to come. As horrible as this tragedy is, there is a parallel with the catastrophe that is the Great War. Fallout Tactics has a depiction of the destruction that occurred in Chicago, and I always thought that this looked awfully fiery. It would be interesting if the bulk of the damage from the bombs was actually due to massive fires that broke out and consumed the city, since up to this point in the series, it seems like most cities have largely been destroyed by the explosive blasts and shockwaves of the bombs. There were a number of prominent buildings that survived the Great Chicago Fire, and it would be poetic if those same buildings survived the nuclear Chicago Fire. And maybe we could expect many of the buildings, or what's left of them anyway, to be blackened with soot. This would give Chicago an aesthetic that we haven't really seen on a large scale before. It would set the wastes of Chicago apart, and would also be, for lack of a better term, appropriate given Chicago's history. 1893 was the year that Chicago hosted the World Fair, which was an especially successful one, drawing in millions of people and helping promote Chicago's architectural style across the United States. Architects in Chicago were developing what we would consider the first modern skyscraper. Designs based on a framework of steel supports and reinforced concrete were first employed in the construction of the Home Insurance Building in 1885, and this new skyscraper design transformed cities across the United States. Fallout Tactics depicts Chicago in a rather futuristic manner, and Fallout 4 also depicted Boston in a retro-futuristic way. There is no reason why Chicago couldn't be represented similarly, but due to the very well-known architectural styles that come from Chicago, one of which is appropriately called the Chicago School of Architecture, then prominent buildings with this style should definitely be represented. In a game where there was a massive nuclear fire, it would also be ironic if the older style buildings survived the destruction a little bit better. Chicago's seedier side had an early start in saloons, which were centers of excessive alcohol consumption and general debauchery that was often opposed by the hardline religious groups of the time. Much of this activity was just accepted, and people would commonly pay off law enforcement so they could just act as they pleased. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a crackdown that forced the gambling, prostitution, and other illegal or unseemly activities underground. The Prohibition era would breathe life into the underground criminal networks and lead to the rise of some of America's most notorious gangsters, like Al Capone, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, and Roger the Terrible Toohey. Crime was also particularly rampant at this time, with an extremely low conviction rate, and part of this was due to a glamorization of criminals and the level of corruption at all levels in the justice system. Given how legendary the organized crime was in early 20th century Chicago, this would have to be represented in the game somehow. Fallout 4 gave us a mafioso-like group, the Triggermen, which, although the group overall was rather shallow, they also stood out from among the other Raider groups. Even in a game where the Brotherhood of Steel, or Super Mutants, or even the Enclave take a prominent role, there could absolutely be room for a general civilian population that is struggling with extremely powerful criminal gangs that are trafficking chems, weapons, or even people. Just because we know the Brotherhood or Super Mutants or the Enclave might be in the game doesn't mean that we can't have one or more criminal groups that function basically as factions as they vie for control. These criminal groups would be different and separate from raiders because they exist within a social fabric rather than outside of it. Things could be made complicated by uncovering that the groups are trafficking humans to the Super Mutants, weapons to the Brotherhood of Steel, tech to the Enclave, and chems to everyone just trying to escape a world that is so messed up. It would also be appropriate for them to take inspiration from the infamous crime groups like the Chicago Outfit, which was a part of the greater Italian-American Mafia, but of course with a Fallout spin on things. Organized crime was so powerful and has been so romanticized in media both back in the day and in the present that this would have to show up in some way, regardless of whether the main story focus is on groups like the Enclave or the Brotherhood. Chicago played a huge role in World War II war production, building giant aircraft factories, producing more steel than almost any other place, Detroit accepted, and training tens of thousands of sailors at the naval base Great Lakes. The factories, in conjunction with the rail yards, could all be part of a greater struggle over controlling the Chicago wastes and its resources. Perhaps playing too hard into this type of thing would make the game feel too much like The Pit, since there is a big focus on industrial production, and although Chicago had very strong trade unions, this might feel derivative of Fallout 76 or the Fallout 76 Pit expansion. The last point about the naval base Great Lakes could make for an interesting faction or sub-faction. The naval base is fairly far north of the city. Actually, it lies outside of the map area I chose, but historically, it has been one of the biggest naval training centers, and in our present day, is the only one. And there is a massive number of Navy personnel that move through. Such a large group with a strong identity could very easily become some sort of faction after the Great War, as society started to break down. In 1942, Chicago was the site of the first controlled fission reaction, as part of the Manhattan Project at the University of Chicago, giving a proof of concept that would eventually lead to the creation of the atom bomb. Now this is something that really gets my heavy water flowing. This is one of the most important events in modern history, and given how nuke-centric Fallout is, there is no way that this could be overlooked. In our modern day, the exact place that the first reactor was built, known as Chicago Pile 1, is commemorated with this sculpture, which is reminiscent of a mushroom cloud and skull, which is located in downtown Chicago. Perhaps in the Fallout world, there is a bigger, more extravagant memorial that could be interesting to find, and, well, I hope you saw this coming. Maybe this location would be a gathering place for some Children of Adam. Not necessarily a large settlement, but treated as a shrine, as part of a pilgrimage that faithful children engage in to seek the holy spot that Adam's power was first given to mankind. This doesn't mean that the children need to be any sort of faction. It could just be a small tie-in to the greater Fallout world, and could show us whether or not the Children of Adam have been able to successfully spread farther than DC and Boston. If a simple shrine or small group of Children of Adam isn't enough, which if my opinion counts for anything, I say the more the better, then there is a lot more that can be done. You see, I chose the southwest corner of the map for a special reason. This rather innocuous wooded area is actually the resting place of Chicago Pile 1, as well as Chicago Pile 5, which was the world's first heavy water reactor. Chicago Pile 1, the first reactor, was disassembled after successfully achieving a controlled reaction to be better studied in a different place with adequate radiation shielding. A facility was built in this Red Gatewood area, where it was reconstructed using the same materials but in an improved form, and given the name Chicago Pile 2. Chicago Pile 2 and Pile 5 were both research reactors on the site until 1954, when they were decommissioned because they were no longer useful for research purposes. The reactors were taken apart, the irradiated materials like the heavy water were disposed of out of state, and the reactor parts themselves were encased in concrete and buried at Red Gate Woods. This area could be another place for the Children of Adam to congregate. This could be a place for them to settle and to declare a holy site, and this could cause conflict if they are digging up radioactive material and contaminating groundwater that other groups rely on, or even kicking up radioactive dust as they are excavating and breaking open the concrete sarcophagi that encase their holy relics. Maybe the Children of Adam in this area were influenced by the iconography of Catholicism, which was dominant in the Chicago area, and this rubs off on them in their art and the importance they place on holy relics. There are just a lot of interesting things that can be done in this area with a group like the Children of Adam. In the 1960s, the O'Hare Airport would be constructed, the busiest in the world, and suburban sprawl would kick into overdrive as wealthier Chicago residents moved out of the city to pursue the American suburbia dream. Since I like to examine the events up until the 1960s, this is as far as I will go, but with how massive the O'Hare Airport is and its prominence as one of the busiest airports in the world, it could make for a unique setting for a faction or settlement, and therefore marks the northwest corner of my proposed map. The movement of people from city to suburbs could also be represented by idyllic 50s and 60s style suburban neighborhoods on the edges of the map. With how important Chicago has been to the history of America, it comes as no surprise that they have also had an impact on US culture. Their infamous Chicago-style deep dish pizza or Chicago dogs could either be referenced in-game or displayed prominently in pre-war hot dog stalls or pizza parlors. Strangely enough, although hot dogs have been mentioned in Fallout, we actually haven't seen any, so maybe Fallout Chicago could change that and give us some post-war mystery meat Chicago dogs. Chicago was the birthplace of Chicago blues, which is considered the inspiration and forerunner for rock and roll. Rather famous artists like Muddy Waters or Buddy Guy helped make Chicago blues popular, and that type of music would be perfectly appropriate in a Fallout game. It would introduce more songs and a slightly different sound that would make Fallout Chicago stand out from the other games, similar to how Fallout 76 stands out due to the number of songs referencing mining. A part of northern Chicago known as Uptown was famous for its entertainment, and this could be reflected in the game as well, being a more lively area with live entertainment akin to something like Good Neighbor from Fallout 4. Chicago has several well-known sports teams and arenas, like the prior mentioned Wrigley's Field, which is the home of the White Sox. I just hope that the Chicago Bulls Arena, whatever it's called in the Fallout world, got a direct nuke after what they did to my precious Utah Jazz in 97 and 98. I will literally never get over that. As far as new creatures or cryptids, there is nothing particularly unique or different about the area that Chicago finds itself in. But if a great fire did take place, like we have mentioned, we could possibly see some interesting creatures related to that event, or a cryptid that was irreversibly changed by the smoke, fire, or ash. There are some interesting unique aspects of Chicago that could provide interesting places to explore, or could somehow be used in game. A long stretch of the lakefront area of downtown Chicago is replete with museums, art exhibits, fountains, and the like that could make fun locations to explore or be the site of settlements. Navy Pier is one such location and has a bunch of attractions and a Ferris wheel. And if you remember, Ferris wheels first debuted in the Chicago World Fair and therefore could be used in a creative way. Certain iconic buildings should also be represented, like the Chicago Water Tower, which survived the first Great Chicago Fire, Art Deco styled skyscrapers like the Carbide and Carbon building, and buildings that conform to the Chicago School of Architecture, like the Civic Opera House, the Wrigley Building, or the Tribune Tower, to just name a few. There should also be a high level of verticality like we were able to experience in Fallout 4's downtown Boston. There is a relatively well-known system of tunnels that were dug under the downtown area of Chicago over the course of several years. Being dug in a grid pattern during the early 1900s, they were not envisioned to transport people like a subway, but instead to provide a number of services to businesses. These small tunnels were built with small gauge railways in mind that would allow the transportation of some merchandise or coal. There were even short-lived attempts to deliver mail through this tunnel system, but it ended up being mostly used for transporting coal to buildings and ash away from them. With how extensive it was and the number of access points in many buildings, it was also used as a cheap form of air conditioning in the summer, since the subterranean air always stayed relatively cool, and in the winter, it was more energy efficient to warm this air than the colder surface air, so it was also used for heating in the winter. Such an extensive system could be a cool aspect of the game, either housing wastelanders and settlements, being a way to get to different parts of the city similar to Fallout 3, or the darker depths could be home to particularly dangerous creatures, and maybe the entrance to an underground vault. The real-life tunnel system was built with fire doors and flooding doors, so sections could be sealed off due to flooding or from nuclear fire, hiding secrets that the player can uncover if they can unseal the doors. Chicago has a pretty prominent Chinatown in the southern part of downtown, and this would be a very good opportunity to display the xenophobia that has gripped the nation. It would be interesting to see this area under extra pre-war surveillance. Maybe we could see evidence and be able to listen to and read recordings of people being whisked away to detention camps that we do know exist in Fallout. Or maybe the city would go to the absurd length of rebranding Chinatown into another kind of random ethnicity, renaming it Serbian Town or something, with hastily scribbled Serbian words over any Chinese characters. It would be at first an absurd and fairly lighthearted portrayal at turning Chinatown into something less Chinese, but the more you would explore and read about what happened, the darker it would get. If there is a large focus on organized crime or criminal groups or families, which would be appropriate to have in Fallout Chicago, then there could also be references or some kind of portrayal of some of the most famous Chicago serial killers. In the late 19th century, a man known as H.H. Holmes was a scam artist that moved to Chicago and built his own house there. During the years of the World Fair, he would lure young women to his home, where he would torture and kill them in various ways. And while that's horrific in its own right, his house was built in a way to confuse guests and facilitate this psychopathic behavior. The so-called murder castle was built with secret rooms, stairs that would lead to nowhere, hallways with strange shapes and angles, a slide from the top floor to the basement, and even a kiln, which I'm just going to pretend he used to fire pottery and absolutely nothing else. Encountering his house could be a bewildering experience, especially if it's occupied by an eccentric wastelander. Another prolific murderer was John Wayne Gacy, who did some gigs as an amateur clown at parties and events in his neighborhood, but was also secretly luring men to his home where they would be abused and murdered. We have already seen a pint-sized slasher, but what about the full-sized slasher? So we have established the potential who, what, when, and where, but the why is outside the scope of this video. So I just want to end it by looking at potential DLC areas. I really only consider large or interesting areas that are outside of the map, but relatively close to Chicago. Some of the large surrounding cities that might have interesting inhabitants or factions are Milwaukee to the north, where maybe we could encounter a faction consisting of people suffering from crippling alcoholism, Indianapolis to the southeast, where all disputes are settled by racing, and St. Louis to the southwest. While I'm half joking about the racing and the alcoholism, if St. Louis is featured, exactly how it would be portrayed would also confirm or negate the finer details of Fallout Tactics, as the super mutants from Gamoran's army inhabit St. Louis. We would officially find out whether the super mutants there are led by a Brotherhood member gone rogue, who assumes Gamoran's position and name, as Tactics portrays, or not. Alternatively, a nature-focused location could be the Starved Rock State Park, which has some beautiful sandstone features and running water. Or we could visit Springfield, Illinois, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, and see what kind of cults of personality formed there in the post-war period. So there we have it. All the applicable lore we know about Chicago, a reasonable map, some timeline considerations, and then the historical, cultural, and unique facts of the city that could easily determine the kinds of people or factions that we could see, the types of locations we could encounter and explore, and the special aspects of Chicago that would set a Fallout game that takes place here apart from the other games that we have encountered so far. I can't help but think of a burned out Chicago with complex groups, some inspired by the gangsters of the 20th century, and a Child of Adam pilgrimage with a noir-like atmosphere. Most of all, I would like to see Bethesda finally commit to how much of Fallout Tactics is actually canon, and a Fallout Chicago would do just that. Fallout Chicago would be an awesome and unique location, and Fallout Tactics Reckoning. As always, I want to hear your thoughts. Any additional ideas, information, things I missed in my analysis, I want the comments to be as informative as the video, so that people that need or want ideas for a Fallout game set in Chicago can have a wealth of resources. So really, let it fly. Follow Adam's path. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next week.